Wait. What is that? Whoa! Ah!
Deep within the wilderness, a female hiker vanished without a trace. Months later, her camera was found revealing footage of hulking silhouettes hurling rocks at her with crushing force. And within those frames, a human voice calls her name from the darkness. Alexandra Tanari's first recovered footage in the Bitterroot Range began abruptly at 3:12 p.m. on June 21st, suggesting that earlier recordings had been lost or deliberately erased. Alexandra appeared on camera walking through towering cedar and fir trees. Her voice, initially calm and professional, described following what she termed an unusual animal vocalization that had drawn her away from her established campsite. Alexandra had been hearing the eerie sound for about an hour as she navigated through undergrowth thick enough to require constant attention to her footing. The noise was unlike anything in her field guides. It was too structured for a typical animal call, and clearly not human. What kind of creature could produce something so deliberate, yet remain unseen? The forest around her showed signs of unusual disturbance. Branches had been broken at heights, suggesting something much taller than a human had passed through moss on tree trunks, or scrape marks in patterns that did not match any known wildlife behavior. Most significantly, she mentions in the footage that a trail camera that Alexandra had positioned earlier that morning was missing entirely. The tree where she had secured the camera told its own story. In the footage, 3 deep vertical scratches scored the bark, each approximately 6 inches long and penetrating nearly an inch into the wood. The spacing between the marks suggested they had been made simultaneously by something with claws or fingers capable of gripping the entire circumference of the trunk. Alexandra's camera work remained steady as she documented these findings. She approached the damaged tree cautiously, using a measuring tape to record the dimensions of the scratches. The precision of her documentation suggested someone accustomed to scientific methodology, making her subsequent observations all the more credible. Could her calm professionalism withstand what was coming next? As she worked, a sound echoed across the valley, a sharp, resonant knock that seemed to come from the opposite ridge. Alexandra froze, her camera automatically focusing on the distant tree line. The sound repeated 3 short knocks followed by 1 longer one, the rhythm too precise to be the result of falling timber or natural settling. Alexandra realized immediately that it was not an echo, her voice carrying a note of nervous excitement rather than fear. She had encountered something that challenged her understanding of forest acoustics, but her scientific curiosity remained stronger than any sense of danger. Alexandra picked up a fallen branch and struck it against a nearby tree, mimicking the rhythm she had heard. The response came immediately. The same pattern, but noticeably closer, and with a slightly different tonal quality that suggested a different striking surface. If it wasn't an echo, then how close had it already come? This means that something in the forest was not only capable of producing structured acoustic signals, but was actively engaging in what could only be described as communication. The response time eliminated the possibility of an echo, and the variation in tone suggested intentional modification rather than simple mimicry. Alexandra attempted the exchange twice more, each time receiving an immediate response that grew progressively closer. Her excitement was audible as she realized that whatever was out there was definitely trying to communicate, and that the pattern recognition was far too sophisticated to be coincidence. Specialists noted that the responding knocks showed characteristics that ruled out human origin. The resonance suggested striking surfaces much larger than anything a person could reasonably carry, and the volume indicated striking force beyond normal human capability. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, footage showed Alexandra making the decision to establish a temporary observation post rather than return to her main campsite. She selected a position with good visibility across the valley, set up her equipment, and prepared to document whatever might emerge as darkness approached. By the time night fully enveloped the forest, Alexandra's audio equipment picked up the familiar nocturnal sounds, but also something else. a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to pulse just below the threshold of conscious hearing. Alexandra whispered to her camera as she adjusted the audio levels to better capture the phenomenon, noting that the sound resembled a heartbeat but was unnaturally slow and impossibly deep. The sound was indeed rhythmic, occurring approximately every 3 seconds with a resonance that seemed to come from the earth itself. Audio analysis would later reveal frequencies in the subsonic range, below normal human hearing but capable of being felt as vibrations through the ground and in the chest cavity. Alexandra's campfire provided a small circle of light in the overwhelming darkness, but beyond its reach, the forest had become an alien landscape. Her thermal imaging equipment, designed for wildlife photography, began picking up heat signatures that defied easy explanation. Large, warm masses moved through the trees at distances that made identification impossible, but their size and movement patterns ruled out known wildlife. How many of them were out there watching her? At 11:47 p.m., according to the camera's timestamp, something changed. The normal forest sound ceased abruptly, as if every creature within miles had simultaneously decided to fall silent. The absence of sound was so complete that Alexandra's own breathing seemed unnaturally loud inside her tent. In the footage, Alexandra's voice grew tight, likely with anxiety, as she realized something was wrong. The forest had gone unnaturally silent, and everything around her had stopped. The silence stretched for nearly 10 minutes, an eternity in a forest that should have been alive with nocturnal activity. Then, gradually, a new sound emerged, the soft whisper of fabric under tension as something brushed against her tent. Alexandra's hand was visibly trembling as she reached for the tent's zipper, her camera focused on the entrance. The brushing sound continued, as if something was examining the structure with careful attention. Was it testing the boundary or testing her reaction? When she finally opened the flap, her light revealed nothing but empty forest, but the ground around her tent told a different story. Footprints surrounded her campsite in a rough circle, each impression clearly visible in the soft earth. The prints were enormous, approximately 16 inches long and proportionally wide, with clear toe marks at the front. The depth of the impressions suggested a creature weighing several hundred pounds, but the stride length indicated bipedal locomotion with a gait far longer than any human could achieve. Alexandra's scientific training overcame her fear as she documented the prints with meticulous care. She used her boot for scale reference, photographed each clear impression from multiple angles, and measured the stride length between consecutive prints. The evidence was undeniable. Something massive and bipedal had circled her campsite while she slept. As she worked, small rocks began landing near her tent. The first few were pebble-sized, barely audible as they struck the ground. But they grew progressively larger, and their placement became more deliberate. Each rock landed closer to her position, as if whatever was throwing them was testing her reaction or trying to provoke a response. The final rock was the size of a softball, landing with enough force to send up a spray of dirt just feet from where Alexandra knelt. The message was unmistakable. She was being warned, tested, or perhaps invited to respond. But respond to what, and by whom, or what? The last sound captured before Alexandra cut the recording was a deep, resonant exhalation that seemed to come from lungs far larger than any human possessed. It wasn't the sharp snort of a startled animal or the huffing of an agitated bear. This was a sigh, deliberate, almost contemplative, carrying an undertone of intelligence that likely froze her in place. In the hours that followed, the recovered footage filled in a grim chronology of disorientation and fear. Alexandra's voice, once analytical and composed, grew increasingly fragmented as she wandered through terrain that seemed subtly altered each time she retraced her steps. Dawn arrived without relief. For 3 hours, her recordings showed her sitting motionless near a stream, trembling, mumbling that the forest was breathing. At 10:17 a.m. on June 22nd, it revealed a dramatically changed Alexandra Tanari, her face drawn, her voice flat, and the analytical clarity that once defined her completely replaced by quiet, hollow dread. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted the camera, and her voice carried a tremor that hadn't been present in earlier recordings. Most telling was her posture, constantly scanning the tree line, shoulders hunched as if expecting an attack from any direction. Alexandra admitted to the camera that she didn't think she had slept more than 20 minutes at a time. Every time she started to drift off, she heard movement just outside the light. Footsteps circling the camp, but always staying just beyond where she could see. Was it still out there, waiting for her to close her eyes again? Her campsite told the story of a sleepless night spent in defensive preparation. The fire had been built up far beyond what was necessary for warmth, with a stockpile of wood that would have taken hours to gather in darkness. Her equipment was arranged in a tight perimeter around her sleeping area, creating multiple barriers between herself and the surrounding forest. But it was the condition of her food cache that provided the most disturbing evidence of overnight visitation. The bear-proof container, designed to withstand the efforts of a 600-pound grizzly, had been opened with a disturbing mix of force and care. The external locking components were battered and torn, yet the chest itself and its latch remained unbroken and largely undisturbed. What kind of creature could open what even a bear couldn't? The contents had been examined rather than consumed. In the footage, the packages shown were opened and their contents were missing bits of it, suggesting something tasted them. Nothing else was missing, but everything had been handled. Most unsettling was what had been added: a large fish head, still fresh, placed deliberately on top of the cooler. Alexandra said in the footage that this wasn't random animal behavior, her voice filled with obvious distress. The placement of the fish head struck her as deliberate, as if it were a gift, or perhaps a challenge. Alexandra made the decision to abandon her planned research and hike out immediately. She packed with efficient haste, but her movements were constantly interrupted by pauses to listen and scan the forest around her. Something had fundamentally altered her relationship with the wilderness. She was no longer an observer, but prey being stalked by an intelligence she couldn't comprehend. The hike began normally enough, following established game trails through terrain that should have been familiar from her approach route. But within an hour, Alexandra encountered the first sign that her departure wouldn't be straightforward. Her compass, a precision instrument she had relied on for years of backcountry navigation, was behaving erratically. What could twist a magnetic field this far from any man-made interference? Alexandra said that the needle kept spinning, tapping the compass face with growing frustration. It would point north for a few seconds, then swing completely around, behavior she had never seen before. Either Alexandra was experiencing equipment failure at the worst possible time, or something in the environment was disrupting navigation instruments. As she struggled with navigation, Alexandra began encountering increasingly obvious signs of manipulation in the forest around her. Young trees had been bent and twisted into crude X shapes. She observed that these were markers, documenting each formation with her camera. She noted that someone or something was marking territory, or perhaps creating a trail system. The strength required to bend the trees was immense, far beyond what any human could accomplish without tools. The bent trees led her deeper into unfamiliar terrain, away from the established trails she had planned to follow. Alexandra recognized the manipulation, but felt compelled to follow, likely driven by a combination of scientific curiosity or maybe a growing certainty that deviation from this path might provoke a more direct confrontation. Was she documenting evidence or walking into a trap? At one of the larger tree formations, Alexandra made a discovery that sent chills down her spine. Caught in the bark where the trunk had been bent was a tuft of hair, long, coarse strands in a reddish-brown color that didn't match any known wildlife in the region. She collected samples with tweezers, sealing them in specimen containers with the methodical care of someone accustomed to evidence collection. She reported that the hair was unlike anything she had seen, examining the strands under a magnifying glass. The texture was too coarse for human hair, and the length and color did not match any regional mammals. As Alexandra documented the hair samples, her camera's autofocus suddenly shifted to the background, revealing a large shadow moving behind the bent tree. The shape was indistinct, but clearly bipedal, moving with a fluid gait that suggested both power and stealth. When Alexandra tried to look directly at the location, nothing was visible, but the audio track captured a sound that made her blood freeze, a deep, huffing exhalation like a bull preparing to charge. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Alexandra stumbled backward, dropping her camera as panic overrode her scientific detachment. The device continued recording the heavy footstep that shook the ground near the microphone. Was it moving toward her, or circling again? When she retrieved the camera, her hands were shaking so violently that the footage became nearly unwatchable. But the audio remained clear, picking up a sound that would haunt investigators for months afterward, a low, grumbling vocalization that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. The sound had structure, rhythm, and variation that suggested language rather than simple animal communication. Alexandra whispered that it was talking, her voice filled with a mixture of terror and wonder. She said that whatever was out there was attempting to communicate, but not with her directly. The sounds were directed at others she could not see. If Alexandra's assessment was correct, she wasn't being stalked by a single creature, but by a group capable of coordinated behavior and complex communication. The isolation she had sought for her research had become a trap, with her as the subject of study rather than the observer. How long had she been surrounded without realizing it? The footage shows Alexandra in a state of near panic, her breathing ragged as she described being lost. She reported that she had passed the same clearing 3 times for hours, her voice tight with frustration and growing fear. Although her GPS indicated she was moving, she kept ending up in the same locations, as if the trails were shifting when she wasn't looking. On a fallen log at the edge of the clearing, Alexandra discovered evidence that her confusion wasn't accidental. She observed that someone had been following her trail, documenting the modified marker with close-up footage. One of her own trail markers, a bright orange ribbon she had tied to mark her route. However, the ribbon was shredded into strips and retied into complex knots. Who had the patience and the intent to do this without being seen? At this point, the psychological pressure was likely becoming unbearable. Alexandra's scientific objectivity crumbled as she realized she was no longer documenting wildlife behavior, but had become part of an elaborate game whose rules she didn't understand. What did they want from her? Fear, or something worse? Then from somewhere in the forest, a human voice called her name, Alexandra, with perfect pronunciation and inflection. The voice was male, middle-aged, and carried the casual tone of someone trying to get a friend's attention. Alexandra's response was immediate and instinctive. She called out, her voice cracking with desperate hope, demanding to know if someone was there and begging for help. The response came from a completely different direction, her own voice repeating the words with exactly the same inflection, tone, and emotional content, down to the crack in her voice and the desperate undertone. Alexandra could hardly believe what she was hearing, her camera shaking as she spun to locate the source of the sound. How could something mirror her so perfectly, down to the tremor in her breath? Alexandra's nerve finally broke completely. She fled the clearing in blind panic, crashing through undergrowth with no regard for direction or safety. Her camera bounced wildly, creating a chaotic record of her flight through dense forest. But even in her panic, the audio equipment continued to function, capturing sounds that would later prove crucial to understanding what was pursuing her. Behind her, barely audible above her own crashing progress, came the sound of something large moving through the forest with surprising stealth. The pursuit wasn't rushed or aggressive. It maintained a steady pace that suggested confidence rather than urgency. Was it toying with her, testing her limits before closing in? At the edge of another clearing, Alexandra stumbled and fell, her camera flying from her hands to land lens up in the soft earth. As she scrambled to retrieve it, the device captured a clear handprint in the mud just feet from where she had fallen. The print was enormous, showing 4 fingers and an opposable thumb, in proportions that were recognizably humanoid but far larger than any human hand. Most remarkably, the print showed clear dermal ridges, fingerprints that proved this wasn't a paw or hoof, but an actual hand belonging to something with primate characteristics. Then, from the darkness beyond her camera's light, came a sound, a series of vocalizations that combined elements of human speech with tones and frequencies no human throat could produce. The sounds had rhythm, structure, and variation that clearly indicated language, but a language unlike anything in human experience. A chilling realization washed over Alexandra as she understood that they were talking about her. Over the next several hours, the footage captured her increasingly frantic attempts to navigate back toward the logging road. Her breathing grew ragged, her pace slower, her flashlight beam jerking erratically across trees. At 9:17 p.m., she stumbled upon the same clearing for the 3rd time, muttering that the trails were shifting. When the timestamp reached 11:43 p.m., the camera showed Alexandra wedged inside the hollow trunk of a massive cedar tree. The psychological torture was unbearable. Rather than attacking directly, her pursuers maintained a presence just beyond perception, close enough to be sensed but never clearly seen, creating a state of constant hypervigilance that was rapidly exhausting Alexandra's mental and physical reserves. Then, the audio track captured the rhythmic crack of branches under enormous weight. Something massive was pacing around her hiding place with the patience of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere to go. Was it waiting for her to move or for her to break? Her voice, tight with controlled panic, stated that the footsteps were too heavy and too slow. Whatever was making them must have weighed at least 500 pounds, yet it moved as if it had all the time in the world, like it knew she couldn't escape. At 12:17 a.m., the nature of the encounter changed dramatically. The steady footsteps stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound that made Alexandra jolt, a deep resonant thump that seemed to come from directly above her hiding place. Something had climbed the cedar tree and was now positioned in the canopy overhead. Alexandra whispered in horror as her camera tilted upward, capturing the massive branches swaying under an enormous weight. The implications were terrifying. Bears could climb, but never with the stealth and precision being demonstrated. The creature had repositioned itself with absolute silence until the moment it chose to reveal its presence. If it chose when to be heard, what else could it choose to control? The terror continued with a series of soft thumps as objects began falling around Alexandra's hiding place. At first, she thought they were pine cones or small branches dislodged by the creature's movement, but as her camera's light revealed the objects, a more sinister pattern emerged. Rocks were being dropped with deliberate precision, each one landing closer to the hollow trunk where Alexandra cowered. The placement wasn't random. It formed a tightening spiral. Alexandra realized, her voice cracking with the strain of prolonged terror, that this was not normal hunting behavior. She was completely at the mercy of something that could have harmed her at any time, but chose instead to demonstrate its control over the situation. Was this communication or a warning of what was coming next? Then came the sound that shattered Alexandra's remaining composure. A huge thump exploded from the darkness, followed by footsteps with terrifying suddenness. Her camera swung wildly as she screamed, capturing fragmentary images of something massive rushing past the opening of her hiding place. The creature moved with impossible speed for something so large, its passage marked by the crash of breaking branches and a roar that seemed to combine elements of bear, big cat, and something entirely alien. The charge stopped as suddenly as it began, leaving Alexandra sobbing and hyperventilating in her hollow tree. But the audio equipment continued recording, capturing what happened next. From the darkness came a series of vocalizations unlike anything in the scientific literature. The sounds combined deep, guttural tones with rapid-fire clicks and what could only be described as structured syllables. Similar to before, they're talking to each other again. Alexandra's nerve finally broke completely. Despite every survival instinct telling her to remain hidden, the psychological pressure likely became unbearable. She burst from her hiding place and fled into the open forest, her camera bouncing wildly as she crashed through undergrowth in blind panic. The pursuit that followed was captured in chaotic fragments, glimpses of massive shapes moving through the trees. But what made the footage truly terrifying was the realization that her pursuers weren't trying to catch her. They were herding her toward a specific destination. Why would predators herd instead of hunt, unless they wanted her alive? Every time Alexandra tried to change direction, sounds would emerge from the forest to guide her back onto a predetermined path. Branches would crash to her left, forcing her right vocalizations would echo from behind, driving her forward. She was being manipulated with the skill of experienced hunters who understood both the terrain and their prey's psychology. The herding continued for over an hour, leading Alexandra deeper into terrain she didn't recognize. Her camera captured glimpses of increasingly alien landscape, rock formations that seemed almost architectural, trees arranged in patterns too regular to be natural, and clearings that showed signs of long-term habitation by something with intelligence and purpose. At 2:33 a.m., Alexandra stumbled into a ravine. Her camera's light revealed a horrific scene. The ravine floor was littered with bones, not the random scatter of natural predation, but organized collections that suggested systematic hunting and consumption over an extended period. Alexandra whispered a trembling curse as her camera panned slowly across the bone field. The bones represented multiple species: deer, elk, smaller mammals, and scattered among them, fragments that were unmistakably human. A hiking boot, partially buried in the ravine floor, still contained the skeletal remains of a foot. Rib bones showed cut marks that suggested systematic butchering rather than random scavenging. But it was the organization of the bone field that provided the most disturbing evidence of intelligence. The remains were sorted by type and size, arranged in patterns that suggested ritual or ceremony. Rather than simple disposal, skulls were positioned at regular intervals around the perimeter, their empty sockets seeming to watch over the macabre collection. They're keeping trophies. At the center of the bone field, the footage showed something peculiar: a nest constructed from moss, fur, and carefully woven branches. The structure was enormous, easily large enough to accommodate something 8 feet tall, and showed signs of regular use. Fresh bedding materials suggested recent occupation. As Alexandra documented the nest, her camera captured movement in her peripheral vision. Something was watching her from the shadows at the ravine's edge. A massive silhouette that remained perfectly still until she turned to look directly at it. The creature's eyes reflected her camera's light, and for several seconds, predator and prey regarded each other across the bone field. Was it studying her or deciding what to do next? The creature's size was overwhelming even at a distance. Standing fully upright, it towered at least 9 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to suggest incredible physical power. Then the creature did something that shattered Alexandra's remaining skepticism about its intelligence. It raised one massive arm and pointed deliberately at something behind her. Alexandra spun to find herself surrounded. 3 more creatures had emerged from concealment around the ravine's perimeter, each one massive and clearly coordinating with the others. She was trapped in the center of their killing ground, with no possibility of escape. The footage that followed captured the final minutes of Alexandra Tanari's freedom. The creatures approached slowly, their movements careful and controlled, despite their obvious physical superiority. They showed no aggression, no predatory excitement, only the calm efficiency of beings who had done this many times before. Alexandra's camera shook violently as she backed toward the center of the ravine, her breathing rapid and shallow. She pleaded softly, her words trembling with exhaustion and fear, saying that she only wanted to go home. The largest creature, the one that had first pointed, approached within arm's reach and made a series of soft vocalizations, almost gentle sounds that seemed intended to calm rather than threaten. Its massive hand reached out slowly. Alexandra seemingly dropped her camera as she was lifted from the ground with surprising gentleness. The device continued recording from the ravine floor, capturing the sound of her voice growing distant as she was carried away. The camera continued recording for another 6 hours, capturing only the empty bone field and the gradual return of normal forest sounds. When the battery finally died, it marked the end of the most comprehensive documentation of unknown intelligence ever recovered from the North American wilderness.